Our first guest today is Stanford economist and Hoover Institution senior fellow John Taylor on the Greek bailout equation. John, welcome.
Good to be here.
John, you write in today's Wall Street Journal that the latest Greek bailout is at least better than the last one for three reasons. Because there's a big debt write-down, a diminished chance of contagion, and a growing recognition of the real policy problems that Greece has. So let's take these in turn. Why do you think this latest debt write-down at about 75% of the Greek debt, why is that enough?
Well, the main reason is that's the kind of change that needs to happen for Greece to get going again. But there's a second important reason, and it's basically the lesson of learning from these bailouts in the past. The bailouts have been to help the creditors for the most part, and so they don't pay the consequences of taking on the risk when it goes bad. So this introduces, again, some market discipline back into the system, which I think is quite important to do.
And John, when you talk about market discipline and creditors, who are the people who are actually suffering here? Are we talking about hedge funds, truly private sector, or are we talking about state-backed banks?
It's a whole wide range of people whoever was holding the debt, and of course it depends on when they bought the debt as well. But it's anyone who's invested in the debt, and some of that is the banks, some of it is individuals, and some of it are the hedge funds. But I think the important thing here, and why I think this is a better situation than the original bailout, of course, where the creditors were supposed to be left whole with no write-down, is has the better potential to work. It's not completely there yet, that's for sure. But it also begins to put in place this idea that when investors make an investment and they get a higher yield because it's risky, they have to pay the consequences. That's really how the market should work. And in this case, this massive intervention, as bailouts have in the past, really gets in the way of the market. So I think there's progress here in the sense they face these facts about the write-down, and we hope that will improve the psychology going forward, but there's a ways to go.
We're talking to Stanford economist John Taylor about the latest Greek write-down. John, in the op-ed you say that contagion maybe wasn't as big of an issue as people had originally anticipated. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, my experience working in the Treasury during crises in emerging markets is people always have incentive to exaggerate the threat of contagion. That gives the more likelihood for a bailout, which people benefit from, and less likelihood of a write-down, which people lose from. So there's a great temptation to exaggerate contagion. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but what we found is that when the policy is predictable, when the response is predictable, that people make their adjustments and they anticipate the event, and that reduces the contagion tremendously. And my example, which I put out in that article, was in 1998, the default from the Russian, the contagion from the Russian default was quite severe because it was a surprise. But the contagion from the Argentina default was very minor because that was anticipated. So it illustrates my point. And I think we're now at a point where a lot of these changes in Greece have been anticipated, and people have made their adjustments of their portfolios and removed the exposure they have to these risks.
Of course, there was another element to the Russian crisis and the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, and that was, of course, the IMF that put in place so-called austerity packages, but also raised taxes at the same time that they were cutting spending. Not exactly growth-inducing measures. What role does the IMF play here, and how could that add an element of predictability or unpredictability to the outcome in Greece?
I would say in this case, the IMF has had less of a central role because Europe has itself, the European Union, has taken on a more important role. But the IMF is acting as an arbiter, if you like, with their forecast, with their recording of what the agreement says, and that's important. And I think in this case, there's more than the austerity aspect to these reforms. There's a recognition there should be more privatization that will help economic growth. There's recognition there should be an attempt to have more adherence to the rule of law that will help economic growth. So while there is an attempt to do the very important thing of have a more fiscal policy which is more responsible, there are these other pro-growth aspects of it. And I wish the Greeks, and I think they're going to do this, would recognize that this will help them. It'd be better if they wanted to do it on their own, but it's the pro-growth aspect of these things that they should do are important. As I mentioned in my piece, Greece ranks so low on basic economic policy, 119th in the world by the Heritage Wall Street Journal Index. So they have enormous potential to improve by taking these economic reforms, supply side reforms, pro-growth reforms.
John, probably only a couple seconds left. Can you rate the chances of Greece being able to push through some of these private sector pro-growth reforms happening in the next 6 months or not? Yes or no?
Well, that's the big question. So what I argued in my piece is that most likely, once the agreement is signed, as they will be tempted again to ask for waivers and to deviate from the agreement. And I think that would be a mistake because it could increase economic growth. And so the big decision point then will be for the Europeans to whether they're going to continue the disbursements on the program. And I think for credibility purposes, this would be the point where they say, we've done all this, we've had 2 bailouts, large amount of money, it's now time for Greece to do these things which will ultimately be beneficial and stop the disbursements if Greece doesn't adhere to the things they should do. I don't know
John,
if that,
I think we're running out of time, so we're probably going to have to leave it at that.